Don't we have a banner on Trump?
Yeah, we do.
I'm looking for it. Okay. Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Law and Legitimacy. It's Tuesday. Our viewer count is low up there. What's going on? There we are. Okay, now we're back up. Good morning. Morning, Michael. How are you?
I'm doing really well. I think I was sharing with you before we started streaming that I'm amped up this morning. Should be joining the trial ranks for a case that's going to court on Monday, so less than a week from now in federal court here in Greensboro. So always excited to be roped in at the behest of a colleague singing my praises. I think I told you he referred me to the other attorney and said I would literally punch myself in the face again with an opportunity to work with Mike Boyer. So feeling good this morning, feeling appreciated.
Nice to get that kind of feedback. You know, I mean, I'm always surprised by it. I was picking a jury in a murder case yesterday in New Haven, which, you know, picking a jury is fun. It's interesting to meet new people. It's interesting to engage in a critical assessment of who they are and where they are in the world. And I'm good at it. And so it's fun to do something you're good at. That I was stunned yesterday by some of the jurors. They just don't follow the news at all. And, you know, one of them up there, she said she hadn't followed the news. She worked with, well, I don't want to say too much about a person who might be on the jury, but she described her work. And I said, well, you don't follow the news at all? No. I said, do you know who's running for president this year? And she didn't. And, you know,
stop it. Really?
Well, she said she didn't. And, you know, I mean, this tells me, and the number of people who forswear, that is, avoid social media is becoming a thing that I'm noticing more and more in jury selection. I think that people are craving genuine human connection in their communities, and they're not content to be satisfied with the social media substitute. Now, you know, I say that here we are on social media, broadcasting and having a live and robust connection with people we've never met, who we know through their screen names, trying to provoke a discussion. But I think it's a discussion we hope that people are taking not just to one another online, but into their communities, trying to build handshake relationships with local vendors, trying to speak more to the actual people in their lives on the ground, because that's where reality is. This is a near miss. It's real enough for government work, but I was surprised by that. The other thing that was, you know, apropos, you know, hearing nice things. So it's the end of the day. I'm leaving court, and all of a sudden across the street, hey, Pattis. I look up at some guy who, I don't know who he is. He says, I always wanted to see you in person. You made my day. And I said, well, thank you very much. You know?
That's funny. Funny.
So the trial of Donald Trump continues. And I think we're a little bit closer to an incarcerated Donald today than we were yesterday. Apparently, Judge Merchan has once again found Donald Trump in contempt for violating the gag order that the judge imposed upon him. Apparently, the statutory maximum for the fine is $1,000. And Trump has imposed, or not Trump, Merchan has imposed that on Trump again, and suggested that, you know, jail time as a sanction is becoming more likely, because the discipline that the court is imposing is unavailing. It is not having the intended effect. It's not deterring Donald from speaking. And so, you know, next week when Michael Cohen testifies, Donald Trump's former fixer, the man who brokered the hush money payments allegedly to Stormy Daniels, it's difficult for me to imagine Donald Trump sitting by with equanimity as Cohen approaches the stand, or even as he testifies. I suspect it'll be a wild week in court. And if Trump speaks out, what will Merchan do?
One thing that strikes me, because two things here. One that I think it dawns on me, but we'll get to that in a moment. The first is I just continue to be baffled by the sheer volume of reporting on occurrences out of this court that come from ostensibly reputable publications. What's on the screen here is from Reuters. Reuters coincidentally also owns a company that provides, legal research uh, uh, and practice management software for attorneys. Um, and for whatever reason, doesn't actually link the order or give anybody access to read the order for themselves. I'm quite sick of that. And when we get to some of our other stuff, other content here this morning, you'll be certain to have that stuff published on the screen for your consumption. But just something I wanted to roll back on there, Norm, and I apologize for wasting a little bit of time, but I think it probably bothers you as well. I find it insulting. Anyway, so the speech in question
Well,
here.
why do you find it insulting, Mike?
I find it insulting because it's fine that the media wants to sort of be brief. They're on a word count, etc. But we live in an era where hyperlinking is one of the easiest things to do. This isn't as though this is print media where you are confined and constrained by physical realities of space and readership, etc. There are paid sections, whatever. You've got to get that's a business model. But the amount of reporting that goes on with respect to this trial is nearly unprecedented. Actually, all 5 of these proceedings taken in tandem is unprecedented. And everybody is following the 10th criminal contempt finding, threatens jail time. Why is it then that you can't simply hyperlink to a publicly available document within the New York State criminal court system so that anybody who accesses the article can simply click through and read what Judge Mershon ordered in his own words? I simply don't understand that. It's fine if there's enough of a narrative that needs to be advanced or some history that needs to be given, context, blah, blah, blah for the story. But what is wrong? And why isn't it an ethical obligation or some sort of expectation on the part of the reading consumer to at least have access to this stuff? There's a popular handle on X. I think it's called the Daily Loud, and it primarily caters to the hip hop and Black community in America. And one thing that I have noticed, and I've told this to certain friends who are like, oh, wow, I didn't even realize that, is that the Daily Loud, for example, will publish a picture of something. It will write a post, and and it's considered news. There's an occurrence that happens. So-and-so does something for blah, blah, blah. And there'll be a picture. It'll garner millions of impressions. And Norm, there is no story linked. There's no story linked in the comments. There's no way for anybody to access any information about the story. It's quite literally a picture. So I think what I'm really railing against is the fact that there is this soft bigotry of low expectations embedded in the decision not to just include a hyperlink to something, a primary source document for people to read. It's absurd to me.
I don't know what I think of it. I keep, as an older person, I keep thinking back to how I consumed news as a young man. And that was intermittently. We would watch sometimes the 6 o'clock evening news with whoever was on, and I would read a newspaper or two. There was no imperative to be involved 24/7. There was no desire even, well, maybe there was a desire, but there was no ability to dip in and out of a nonstop screeching debate with people from every walk of life, offering memes, suggestions, images, sometimes full opinions, whatever they like. And I think I was far happier. I think the world was far better off. This information deluge leaves aside standards of reliability. It's not curated or edited. I mean, that was the beauty of reading a well-edited newspaper. That was the beauty of looking at a news organization that spent considerable resources trying to determine what's true. Now everyone's their own publisher, and the algorithms link us to one another depending on what we are outraged by. And I can't help but decide whether we are living in an echo chamber,
I love this comment from Nick Dev. Hyperlinks, as we know them, have only been around since the early 1990s. Just wait a few years.
Yeah, well, what's going to happen in a few years, Nick? I want to know, because
the point there, Norm, is that I think the point that I'm making is that the consumer needs to start. I guess we maybe just here on Law Pod Daily, we'll start telling people that they should expect and demand more from their information purveyors. They only get away with this, and I mean the primary news purveyors of the day only get away with it because there isn't a demand for that kind of stuff. And, there's one of two ways that this can change. One is that the groundswell of demand for that creates a market condition that companies react to, and then they start actually respecting the integrity of their role and giving people the dignity of being able to read for themselves what's being reported on. That's number one, and probably the more unlikely of the two. The other is that people just begin to start understanding what it requires to access publicly available documents via their state and federal court systems. Attorneys like us have access to Pacer. Now, that's not saying that everybody is going to have access to Pacer, but it's also not a free service, Norm. And so we can pull down every piece of information on a federal docket in any federal jurisdiction in the United States, every single item that's included there from any case in the federal court system. I just think that these companies like Reuters that do these things, and I know this is not a federal case, but there are four other matters, three of which are intensely federal, that Trump is involved with. And this issue that I'm speaking of is not isolated to Trump alone. So I didn't mean for this opening segment to be dominated by this sort of like soapbox issue for me. Lawyer Will says it pisses him off too.
We talked. We kicked around the idea over the weekend, and maybe earlier this week or late last week, I can't recall, about having various agenda items for this page. And I think, one agenda item would be what I would call the sort of one world project. And what I mean by that is, we're all online this morning and we are sympathetic to one another and our one another's concerns, or we wouldn't be talking or listening. And one of the concerns we're identifying is a need for reliable information about critical public events. And the reason for that is we live in one world. In other words, a world in which things occur. I think that to the degree public documents are necessary, these public documents will help sculpt the reality of a debate.
And look at this on the screen. So Lawyer Will over on the other platform. I don't know that we're allowed to even mention platforms around here anymore. Who knows the rules? From Lawyer Will, he says, if you use Pacer, I'd recommend downloading the Recap browser plugin. It uploads every PDF you access on Pacer to the public domain. That's interesting. I'll look into that further. Will, thank you for that tidbit. Anyway, we can actually talk about the essence of this case because we have plenty of people commenting. Before we move on, there was a nice Rumble comment from Goodfella D. When she said she didn't watch social media, Norm should have asked, not even Law Pod Daily? You got to promote the show, Norm. So we got to work on your instincts there a little bit. Bathtub Liquor says it would be a good thing for X to work on providing access to the actual documents. And I know Court Listener does a good job as well. But I again, this is sort of my pet peeve, soapbox issue, whatever you want to call it. But I don't think it's unimportant or inconsequential. It does matter a lot because what I was going to talk about with respect to this issue is simply the speech in question, Norm. What's reported on in both Reuters and New York Sun and these others is this April 22nd quote from Trump, where he appeared on on Real America's Voices program called Just the News, No Noise. And the quote in question that I think was sort of the primary invitation from Judge Merchan to find him in contempt was something like this, quote, this is from Trump. The judge is rushing the trial like crazy. Nobody's ever seen a thing like this. That jury was picked so fast, 95% Democrats. The area is mostly all Democrat. You think of it as just a purely Democrat area. It's a very unfair situation, that I can tell you. And so before you comment on that, I'd like to also talk about the fact that Trump is also throttling what he is saying to reporters. So the other reporting on Trump is him telling the media that there are things, they're asking him questions and there are things that he can't say. So my question is simply this, Norm. If he is going to offend the dignity of the judicial system every time he speaks in a way that Judge Merchan finds to be contemptible within the boundaries of the law, and guide Judge Merchan to want to protect the jurors for otherwise benign comments, at least in my estimation. I don't mean to characterize your opinion on this, Norm, but what is the point of Trump withholding anything? What's the point of him having any discretion at all? Even with media down in Miami saying that there are things that he can't talk about because of the gag order, et cetera. If you're in his camp, if you're his attorney and he asks you that question, how do you respond?
And what's the precise question?
The precise question is, well, why would I filter anything that I have to say on this if what is being taken in context in the state of New York right now is worthy of a fine and a threat of jail time? Why would I throttle anything that I'm saying?
Continue to speak, you're going to go to jail. I mean, that would be my reaction.
Well, but I mean, Trump has said that if it takes him going to jail, the Constitution is more important than him going to jail. That's his perspective.
Well, and so he can go and he can frame the constitutional issue. And, I think that, we had some interesting discussions last week on laid back law with Joe and company about Nebraska Press Association, Gentile versus Nebraska Press Association, and the source of the court's inherent power to see that justice is done. I think that, Trump, in the end, I think separation of powers justifies a court's having inherent power over its proceedings to see that the parties receive a fair trial. And separation of powers is a structural concept of enormous significance. It goes to the core of our federal Constitution. The Bill of Rights poses limits on what the federal Constitution can do and what it can't permit. And so let's frame this issue up in the Trump case. Under the separation of powers doctrine, a court has inherent supervisory authority to see that the parties appearing before it get justice. The First Amendment says that that you can't limit a person's speech. How do you resolve the conflict between a inherent power arising out of the separation of powers doctrine and the guaranteed right to freedom of speech? I think that issue is going to have to be teed up for yet another Supreme Court case involving Donald
and I think
Trump.
Trump is already pushing pressure. He's like, I think he said something to the effect that that the appellate courts should step in and weigh in on this. And not that they can step in a manner of speaking, but I think we understand the implication there.
All right, well, let's move on. It looks like this train is going to continue to head toward a station and perhaps a wreck. My view is that it's going to take the Supreme Court to, my view is the issue isn't even fully framed yet. It certainly isn't in my mind. I mean, today's the closest I've come to finding a way to advance this in a principled way under law. That is, that we've got a judicial branch that is that has plenary power, that is, has absolute power to determine how to do its job with respect both to the legislative branch and the executive branch. There are checks and balances between these branches to make sure that no one gets out over their skis and abuses their power. I get that. Then individuals have certain rights as against the government, however the government acts, arising out of the First Amendment. Trump may be right that his First Amendment right, quote unquote, trumps the inherent supervisory power of the judicial branch to see that the parties before it have access to justice, and fair trials. But I think it's going to take a court decision to decide that, because as I read the cases, and I'm no scholar in the area, I've litigated some of these claims on behalf of my clients, even tried to get the U.S. Supreme Court involved on behalf of some. But I'm just not aware of a case that squarely pits the inherent plenary supervisory power of the judicial branch to see that justice is done against a litigant, a trial participant's right to speak. And this is a clean example.
Well, so if this issue is so sensitive from Judge Merchan's perspective, right, that and again, I don't, not to belabor the point, but you've advanced this possibility before, Norm. Why has there not been entertained the option of sequestering the jury for this state criminal trial? If the intent here is to run a fast trial, and the risk to Trump running his campaign, which at this point is in effect a counter action to the multiple lawsuits that he's facing during an election year, why is it that the jury can't be sequestered in this case?
I think the jury can, and the court has the inherent power to do that. Let me just get rid of this call for a minute. I think the court has the inherent power to do this. I think they typically don't because it's inconvenient, it's expensive, and
Well, I mean, I'm finding a hard time believing that there's any other, that there's a case that would compel scrutiny of that decision like this one does. So
no, I agree. I agree.
especially if we're gonna continue to run into this problem, which it seems obvious that we will, and that's kind of why I asked the question about why would Trump filter his commentary whatsoever, if even a fraction of it is going to be taken as you know worthy of a finding of contempt. I just think that the judge at this point has more than an obligation to continue scolding the defendant when the defendant is who he is the front runner for the Republican Party in this year's presidential election, and is running a campaign that is in part designed to take the power from these lawsuits and use that to his advantage. It seems the neutralizing force here would be to protect the fact finder and protect the decision maker, right?
Agreed.
So
Agreed.
anyway, so Norm, this is something that we didn't get to yesterday that I wanted to kind of put between the Trump thing and the FTC and the principle of comity. So will you take the lead on this? I think the question that we're going to have is really, how does this relate to the law? And I'm not sure I know the best way to answer it, or at least not as effectively as you will.
I'm not sure I do either. So I'm watching political debate in the United States with a growing sense of dis-ease, and a sense that rather than being occupants of a republic as defined by Cicero, composed of people with common interest and common conceptions of right, we are people with common interests, that is at least generally expressed, a desire for a good life, but that we have differing conceptions of right, where our rights come from, how they're to be executed, how to prioritize them. And the result is that we are fracturing, ideologically speaking, in ways that will potentially affect our ability to achieve our common interests. And so, during the George Floyd Juneteenth, summers of love in 2020, I was deeply offended by the rhetoric of white supremacy. The notion that if you're a white person, you need to check your privilege, and that somehow Black lives mattered in ways that other lives did not. And I was openly hostile and critical of the Black Lives Matter project, and deeply suspicious of any effort to characterize me as a possessor of white privilege, said privilege needing to be checked in the interest of distributive justice every time I encountered a person of color.
I actually really liked your the foundations of a joke you had about needing woke insurance.
Yeah, woke insurance. That's right. Yeah, and the joke goes something like this. I called my insurance agent the other day and asked him for woke insurance. He said, "What's that?" I said, "I'm an old white guy. Everything's my fault. How am I going to afford to pay for all this?" And he called me back to say, "Well, there is no woke insurance." And that joke itself has inflamed a lot of people. I'll get a lot of sarcastic comments about woke insurance. I have a similar reaction to efforts to quote unquote stigmatize or smear Christian believers in the United States as quote unquote Christian nationalists. If you look at our founding documents, this was a country steeped in Christian theology. Some of the greatest debates in American social life have had to do with man's relationship between himself and God. Some of the greatest conflicts in European history involve conflicts over religious identity. And these were almost always Christian identities. The anti-slavery movement, Mike's pointing out something here on the screen, blossomed in the burned over soil of the Second Great Awakening, its uproarious revivals winning converts to Christianity and abolitionism. I recently, I'm involved in a somewhat interrupted project to read through a series of American histories. And the American history I read was a college textbook prepared by a Baylor professor. The Baylor professor, Baylor being a Baptist institution in Texas. And he was very robust in his discussion of Christianity as a formative influence on the Republic. Now, if you say that in certain circles now, you get accused of presenting an ideological version of American history that ignores dynamics of power, of exploitation, and you end up getting lectured on Christianity as a sort of ideological superstructure that justified the power relationships between the oppressed and the oppressors. And this is sort of strictly speaking a Marxist or Marxian analysis of things that views religion as the opiate of the people. That what drives history are material relationships between folks, and ideas are meant to justify or cement or make concrete their relations at a particular point. This is a discussion that just goes nowhere. It seems to me that there is indisputably a Christian foundation to much of what goes on in the United States, and there is indisputably an ideological use to be made of that foundation in our current politics, and that ideological use of it can be hostile to the building of a pluralistic community. And maybe the notion of a pluralistic community is even inconsistent with the notion of a Christian republic. I don't know what to make of this debate. I do know that the effort to stigmatize and bury large portions of our history seems to me to come at a tremendous cost. And it seems to me to come at a cost of creating further divisions. The United States has always been a fluid continent. In other words, North America contained no Christians when the first settlers arrived, but it did contain Native American people who had a spiritual tradition and spirituality all of its own. These peoples struggled, and Native Americans were vanquished in large part, either extinguished or marginalized on reservations and efforts made to Christianize them. That's not a pretty history. If you are a member of a Native American community that was largely wiped out, it's a tragic history. And Christianity is broad enough to encompass a definition of the tragic. Augustine points out again and what has pointed out, and I say again and again, sin is love of the wrong thing, and the city of man is not the city of God. And so I think that our efforts to construct a community that in which we all want to live, and our use of religion to advance that narrative, comes with a real danger of a sinful application of a religious tradition. I mean, to the degree that the major theologies of the world tend to agree, they tend to agree on the overall overabundance and overwhelming power of love as a means of uniting people. And
Well, I don't, from my part, this opinion piece responds to what is in the title called a smear campaign against Christian nationalists. And I can tell you unequivocally, Norm, that the term Christian nationalist has been used as a pejorative, especially in the years following 2020. And we can't forget that as you're talking about the George Floyd riots and the Summer of Love, this is also the timeline runs parallel with the restrictions based on the coronavirus, right? And the amount of ink, the digital ink spilled in think pieces and faux research related to the real problem with America is those, sovereignty, freedom loving right wingers that are afraid and would put, economic liberty and personal liberty over the interests of others, which is a theme that you and I have traced before, Norm, right? That I think from the frame of, what has communist China done to secure an advantage in responding to things like global pandemics and things like that, right? Is sort of that monolithic mind, that hive mind, the ability to respond in a uniform way. But that's counterbalanced by the idea that our 10th Amendment and, what's not left to the states, but our fragmented republic, right? And that forced inefficiency that is our three co-equal branches of government allows us the ability to act as our own stewards, right? And what I'm realizing now is that with this massive roll up of power at the federal level, it resembling more of an oligarchy in the United States than ever before, especially added into that, the tech component. And you started by talking about, sort of this flee from sort of the secular tech world that we live in. I think that what this reacts really to principally to is the tool that is being advanced undercover to smear uh, the faith-driven Christians as the next sort of domestic terror, um, the next domestic terror threat, right? And the Department of Justice has said the same, and not so many words, but those who are labeled as Christian nationalists are being labeled in a way that would put them within the crosshairs of censorship and criminal investigation and otherwise. And I think that is truly, if we take this to the logical extreme, the real threat of not responding to that in a way that Mr. Ralph Reed has in this Wall Street Journal opinion article.
Well, that's a great point, and it certainly makes me want to pay more attention to this. It would be a crashing irony that people whose claim is that there is a revealed truth in the Bible and that God has spoken to His people. It would be a crashing reversal of American history to regard these people as terrorists.
I agree, because I go back to the origins of the United States, and I don't know what you make of this, Norm. There isn't exactly an undiscovered area of the map physically where America could be recreated like it was in its inception, right? And I say undiscovered from the perspective of the collective West at that time. But, it is the case that we are a nation of laws, but laws created by men, and that architecture exists beneath the sovereign God, right? And our rights, as vested in the Bill of Rights, as recognized in the Bill of Rights, are endowed to us by that creator. And therefore, and I've said this before, that the Constitution is in itself an inherently limiting doctrine, right? It is, it creates those contours of civility, polite society, where we all do subvert our personal freedoms in the interest of a collective good, but not so far as to never have any discretion or discernment of our own, right?
Yeah, no, I hear you. Well, it's an interesting story. It's again one of those stories that, in my view, bends my mind. It sort of challenges my assumptions about the nature of the American Republic, even about the nature of American history. And I remind folks of the project, but I've taken a break from it. I'm returning to it. I can't remember the name of the first textbook I read. I think was the author Lee? Can you remember? Doesn't much matter. I'm reading the Eric Foner history now, People's History of the United States, which takes an entirely different perspective. Whereas the first book took the perspective of the sort of triumphalist Christian narrative about the creation of the United States and the role of religion in shaping our political discourse. Foner takes the view that we ought not to read history from the standpoint of those winners who wrote it, but that we ought to regard history from the standpoint of those losers who lost particular battles and focus on what they lost. And so it begins with a discussion of the destruction of the Arawak tribe in the 16th century when Europeans arrived. And one of the things that emerges is a crushing spiritual devastation. These people lost not just their land, but recognition of their way of life. And often, I think, in the understory of history are conflicts between ways of life. And they're not so much conflicts between bread, trains, and electricity. They're conflicts between what's good, necessary, and righteous. And ideas and faith and culture matter a great deal. And the turmoil in the United States reflects a culture in turmoil. And I think the challenge for podcasts, at least like ours, is to try to create a community of loving kindness, where we can respect the other and their point of view, and try to bring everyone into one tent into one community where we can all achieve our common interests and develop a common conception of right. And, I note in the classical liberal presentation of the good life, a commitment to pluralism, a commitment to respect for people with differing views about the nature and destiny of mankind and of life. And, it may be that we need to revisit that tradition. It may be that classical liberalism needs resuscitation. Don't know. Don't have the answer to these questions. Can't provide them all in the half an hour we've allotted to ourselves each day on law and legitimacy, but we can at least note the issues and encourage others to discuss them, and encourage others to discuss them in their community and to bring these discussions to your community. There is dis-ease in the United States, and we are capable diagnosticians, all of us. So
well, once upon a time, Norm, and I think you and I will agree to kind of shelf this one for tomorrow, because I do want to talk about the principle of comity, and also just because the non-compete thing is ongoing. There's plenty to dissect from a constitutional perspective within this lawsuit, as well as the one that will likely be merged with it out of the Eastern District of Texas from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. But I do remember once upon a time, Norm, that you were going down the rabbit hole to understand from a historical perspective what the conditions were that made what's the right word here? I don't want to get us buzzed. But the conditions for the people to replace their government in the United States. And I recall just a couple of years ago, you and I were talking about that, and you had an earnest interest in understanding what that was and how we would even measure that against the current conditions in the United States. Maybe it's time to dust that off and refresh our recollection a little bit.
Time to dust off a lot. And so there's time, and we hope plenty of time on law and legitimacy to discuss everything, just not all at once. So folks, we'd like to take this discussion to your communities, and we're looking for opportunities to get invitations to come and speak in your communities. Obviously, those would come with compensation. We're not. I can't afford to travel for free, and we would. But we have a message to tell, and we'd like to take it out in the community. We'd like to share it with others. We'd like to make this into a discussion that takes place not just online, but in communities near you. So consider giving us an invitation to come to speak to a local group, and we might respond if the economic conditions are right. Candidly, everybody's got to eat.
Well, and I think Dawn raises a great point here as you give that little bit there, Norm. A major symptom of dis-ease is that no one in my world talks in public about politics here. So maybe our charge here, Norm, is to rendezvous in real life, IRL, as they say. And so this is, I think, an invitation for those of you that get up every morning and watch us for 30, 45 minutes, whatever the case may be, to think about what associations and organizations that you're a part of, whether there's an overlap to be had, and whether you would be interested in working with us to figure out what the contours of that ultimately are. I think that, local bar associations are a great place for Norm, but I also think that, law and legitimacy needs to be something that we create a real life experience for. So if there's a demand for that, sorry, Bootsid says do a meetup. Yeah, I think that's what we're talking about, is what sort of live in-person meetup can we do, and what do you want from that? So if you have ideas, you can hit us on X, you can hit us on email at pattispodcast@gmail.com, Rumble, YouTube, @LawPodDaily. Send us a note. You can leave a comment in the video of this. No matter what, if you're watching the stream still, you better have liked it, and you better have made sure you're subscribed. So Norm, I'll see you tomorrow morning, my man.
You will. How do people find us?
Yeah, we're here every day, 8 a.m. Eastern time, Monday through Friday, on YouTube, on Rumble, and on X. You can also find our audio-only episodes uploaded directly after the stream ends to Apple, Spotify, Google, Overcast, Audible, wherever you find your premium podcasts. Thank you, Sue.
AMF, Yo-Yo.
As wonderful as you are. Catch y'all tomorrow. AMF, Yo-Yo. See you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.